Well, good morning, Spokane. We're going to get started. For those that are still standing, trying to find a seat, there are a number of seats on both sides, so if you're looking for a place to land. And we're going to get started. So again, good morning, Spokane, and welcome. I'm Alicia Benson, and I'm the CEO here at Greater Spokane Incorporated, and it is my honor to have each of you with us today. GSI has been hosting the economic forecast here in the Spokane region for 27 years, and we're excited to partner once again with the Journal of Business as we all can come together to hear from our local economists, their critical insights into our national, local, and international economies, and embracing this year's theme, which is embracing growth in uncertain times, which certainly speaks to the challenges and opportunities in our region, across our country, and across our globe as we navigate the economic uncertainty ahead. I want to give a huge thank you to Paul Reed and the team from the Journal of Business for working with us on today's event. Let's give them a round of applause. We're going to get moving, a little blood flowing this morning. And a reminder as you leave today, we'll have a special insert that you're able to take with you that the Journal of Business has prepared that has great insights from our economists speaking today, as well as from others throughout the region. So make sure to grab that on your way out. We're gonna be honest here for a moment, I have been awake since about 3 a.m. this morning, thinking about this moment. Nothing like having an economic forecast the morning after a very large election season. I bet if you're like me, a few of you are also waking up a bit bleary-eyed, and there are a whole range of emotions running through yourself, through your team, through your family, through your organizations. Excitement, uncertainty, anxiety, wonder, all things that I think is really important that we just hold space for today as you are here in this room, as you go back into your offices, as you talk to your friends and family across the globe, that you hold that. It's so important. And you know, as I laid awake thinking about all of those emotions, one of the things that was so kind of core and center for me is that I am hopeful for Spokane. I'm hopeful because despite all of those emotions and feelings, every single one of you got up and showed up in this room this morning, and that's incredible. It speaks to the mass power of community and to the importance of what we do and how we show up every single day for ourselves, for our family, for our organizations, and for our community. So thank you. You should give yourselves a round of applause. I was also thinking about, we had this opportunity recently to host a conversation with two incredible individuals who led the conversation and the negotiation process around the end of oh my gosh, sorry, I'm like shaking thinking about this because it was so impactful. The negotiations that led to the end of what would have become the Civil War in South Africa. And these two gentlemen had so much inspiration and ideation to share with our community and with us as leaders. And at the very end, one of them looked at our group in the room and said to us his final comment, which really has sat with me over the course of the last few weeks. He said that no matter what happens in your elections, U.S. democracy must prevail. The world, our people in South Africa, and every other democracy across the globe is depending on it. Let that sink in. They're depending on us as Americans to keep showing up. And so I want us to do something right now. I know you all just sat down and you all just got your breakfast, but this is so important because it starts with community. I want you to take a moment to look at the person sitting at your table, somebody behind you, stand up and shake the hand of somebody you haven't met yet this morning, give a hug to a friend or a stranger. No rules here. I'm a hugger, so that's true. But this is about community, so just take a minute and do that. Thank you. Thank you, Spokane, for showing up. And remember, let's lead forward together. We have so much opportunity ahead, so thank you. And so thinking about opportunity, let's dive into why we're here today for the Regional Economic Forecast. To get us started, I'd like to invite my colleague, Yolanda Pagadoin up, who's going to lead us through our land acknowledgement. As she makes her way up here, just a note on the screen is the QR code that you can use throughout the course of the conversation today to submit your questions for the conversation at the end. And so, Yolanda, over to you.
Well, good morning. Tots may we. That's good morning in Nez Perce. I'm Yolanda Pagadoin. I'm of the Lummi Nation. I'm a descendant of Yakima, Nez Perce, Colville, Spokane, and Oglala Sioux tribes. I am honored to acknowledge that the Greater Spokane Incorporated Office and the various locations of convening for business and events are located on traditional and sacred homelands of the Spokane tribe. We also acknowledge that the Spokane region we serve spreads across the traditional and sacred homelands of the Confederated Tribes of Colville, Kalispel Tribe, and the Nez Perce Tribe. These lands hold indigenous and cultural DNA, and we are honored and grateful to be here on traditional lands. We give thanks and respect to the legacy of the original peoples, tribal leaders, our elders, and their descendants. We pledge to honor their stewardship and values on behalf of GSI staff, our board, and our partners. Katsi out out.
Thank you, Yolanda. Next, I'd like to take a moment, and I know there might be a few of them that are that made it up this morning. I want to thank all of our local and state representatives that are joining us this morning. If you're one of our elected officials, if you'll just take a moment to stand up so we can thank you for putting your step forward and leading. Don't be shy. I see you, Councilmember Cathcart. Thank you for being here. Next, I want to just say a thank you to the businesses that are investing in our community through the work that GSI does, with a special shout out to some of our top tier investors. All of their names are here on the screen. If you'll give them a round of applause for being our Leadership Circle investors. And next, I want to thank the sponsors that make today's economic forecast possible. Our presenting sponsor, US Bank, thank you. Our executive sponsors, Alaska Airlines and Idaho Central Credit Union, thank you. Our major sponsors, Baker Construction and Development, Inc., DoorDash, Giza Credit Union, and Kalispel Tribe of Indians, thank you. Our supporting sponsors, the Community Colleges of Spokane and Global Credit Union, and our event sponsor, Whitworth University, thank you. And now an opportunity for a message from our presenting sponsor, US Bank. Joining me on stage this morning, I think she's coming up. I'd like to welcome Shelley Klom, who's the VP of Business Banking for US Bank, to share a few words. Come on up, Shelley.
Good morning. So great to see so many people here after, I don't know about you, like it was a little bit of a late night last night. It's been a little heavy these last couple of weeks, but we're gonna kind of change things up this morning and kind of liven things up as well. And we're gonna give some money away. No, not money to all of you individually, but to some really great nonprofits. Like Alicia said, I'm Shelley Klom. I'm the sales manager for our Eastern Washington Business Banking. And up here with me, I have Esther Richmond, who's our Community Affairs Manager for Washington, and also Brian Young, who's our district manager for our retail banking. And so in case you didn't get enough voting in, we're gonna ask you to vote one more time. And these are for great nonprofits that everybody can get behind here. So if you can get your phone out, and we're gonna open up the polls here. So get your phone out, go ahead and scan the QR code. And while everybody's voting on an organization that's gonna receive some money here this morning, I'm gonna turn the microphone over to Esther, who's gonna talk just a little bit more about these great nonprofits, SNAP and AHANA, and also about our U.S. Bank Foundation.
Awesome, thanks, Shelley. All right, just when you thought you were done voting, we gotcha. While you're all doing that, I do just want to take a moment to talk about U.S. Bank Foundation and our local philanthropic efforts for the state. Our U.S. Bank Community Possible platform invests time, resources, and passion into economic development by supporting efforts to stable jobs, access to homes, and creating vibrant communities. We do this through community investment and volunteerism. We've invested over $3 million this year alone across Washington state, which is so great, to build thriving communities and empowering human potential. An important aspect of this work is sharing space like today. Sharing space to highlight our community partners and giving them a platform to be recognized for their incredible work and their incredible efforts that help small businesses thrive and connect individuals and families with sustainable housing. We are joined here today with two incredible community partners. As you can see through the app, we have the Spokane Neighborhood Action Partners, who are focused on overcoming housing needs specific to home ownership and prevention programs. AHANA, a multi-ethnic business association focused on advocacy, education, technical assistance support, and development growth for multicultural businesses. We are thrilled to call them our partners and to be able to highlight them today. So, did everyone get a chance to vote? Are we ready? Show results? Okay, I'm gonna pass this over to Brian here because he gets to give the good news. I do it a lot, so gotta share the love with my team.
Wow, all right, well, good morning. Hope everyone's having a fantastic breakfast, and we know that these two organizations that are gonna join us here on stage in just a moment are excited about the opportunity to receive funding from the U.S. Bank Community Possible Grant Foundation. If I could have our representatives from SNAP and AHANA join us on stage. If we can bring our poll results up. Oh,
Just kidding.
Oh, you have them? Shelley has them. So one of the things that is really important at U.S. Bank is that we get involved in the community. And so before I announce the winner of our, so we didn't say the dollar amount. One of these organizations is going to win $30,000 or is going to be granted $30,000 this morning. But I just wanted to say that I hope that all of you will take the initial charge here to join up with an organization if you haven't yet. Find one of these two individuals today at the meeting and see how you can partner up, because we know that the causes that they serve are very important to our community. But in the interest of bringing us all together, so we know some of you last night stayed up late hoping that you'd win, and then you saw the elections, and you're either really happy or really sad, but I want you to know you can all be really happy this morning and give a big round of applause, because both of these organizations will be leaving today with $30,000 courtesy of U.S. Bank.
Well, let's give another round of applause to the team from U.S. Bank and to our friends at AHANA and SNAP, to Julie and Marva, just incredible partners doing such important, as Julie and I discussed this morning, human work. So thank you. So I would like to next welcome up our partner in many, and a really important friend, leader, mentor of mine, Paul Reed, the publisher of the Journal of Business, who's going to kick off the program and introduce our economists. So over to you, Paul.
Are we ready? Everybody get enough coffee? Enough coffee? So how many here had an easy time with budgeting for 2025? Show of hands? Yeah, I thought so. Me either. What will inflation do? What will interest rates do? When there's a good jobs report, are we supposed to be happy or concerned about inflation? I think we're uncertain about how long we're supposed to be uncertain. Can't remember who came up with the theme for this time, one of our great economists this morning. I hate you, but you're right. Uncertainty has been a part of our lives. That's why we're here this morning. And really, not to raise the bar too high, but you guys have to help us with this uncertainty this morning, all right? So we are excited, as always, to have three highly respected economists returning to share their perspectives on the national, regional, and local economies. Today we have three vignettes. First up is a national international outlook by Steve Scranton, then a look at inflation, affordability, and growth by Dr. Vange Hockheimer, and to bring it home, a regional and local outlook with Dr. Grant Forsythe. You can submit questions about today, or really any questions you have for these economists on your phones. If you go to, and you'll have to forgive me because my bifocals will fail me, POLLEV.com/GSI events 376. Looks like there's a QR code that'll help you. Or text the number 22333, there's more, with GSI events 376 in the message. So do those. I'm counting on you, because if you don't ask questions, then you're going to hear questions from me, and that's not going to work out well. So also note the information presented here today will be recorded and available exclusively at greaterspokane.org for 1 week starting Thursday. So we're going to begin with Steve. Steve Scranton is the chief economist for Washington Trust Bank and holds a chartered financial analyst designation with over 40 years of investment and economic experience. In Steve's role at Washington Trust Bank, he participates in public speaking engagements, as well as authoring multiple communications to keep clients and public informed of economic and investment market conditions. Throughout the Pacific Northwest, Steve is a well-known speaker on economic conditions and world financial markets. Steve is a rock star, so let's give him a rock star welcome. Welcome, Steve Scranton.
Thanks, Paul. And good morning, everybody. Let's dive right in. Since we're talking economy today, not politics, I'll dive right into the national economy. And then, as you heard from Paul, Vange and Grant will follow from here. I'm going to remind everybody, those who haven't heard me speak before, that when I look at the economy, I always look at it through the lens of jobs, because jobs are what create income. Income is the fuel that consumers use to spend, and consumer spending still accounts for almost 70% of U.S. economic growth. So let's kick off and see, where do we stand with jobs right now? And what I would tell you is, and I'm not looking at October's jobs number we know is distorted by weather, 2 hurricanes, plus the Boeing strike. So we're really going to need October and November together to get a picture there. But I'm looking through September. And the perspective that I wanted to give you is, if we look at the time period of January of 2023 through September of 2023, we had jobs growth averaging 264,000 jobs a month. Now we have, for the same time period in 2024, we have 188,000 jobs per month. So clearly slowing, but hardly what I would say is that, falling off a cliff or in danger of a major problem. I would give you the perspective that if we look back in 2019, where we had an economy that was growing solidly, for that same time period, the average was 173,000. So my message to you is, jobs are still growing, but they are slowing. Then when I look at the income side from that, I look at on personal income, which is both wages as well as any other income sources you have. I always look at real disposable personal income, because that takes out inflation and it takes out taxes. And to me, that leaves you what they actually have to spend. And what we can see from the graph, the green line, is that real disposable personal income, 3.1% growth rate over the last year as of September. That's a solid growth rate, and as you can see from the graph, it has been pretty solid there for the last 2 years. So the consumers are still seeing their income support their spending, and that's evidenced by when we look at the red line, which is real spending, real personal spending, which once again takes out inflation. So it's actually saying how much more are you buying, not just are you paying more for the same amount. And we see that that's also growing at a 3.1% pace. So my basic feedback for you there is that if the consumers are spending at a 3% pace and they make up 70% of economic growth, that means that we've got a base of essentially 2% growth being driven by the consumer, plus the spending from the government and from businesses. So I would tell you, my thoughts are, looking at the economy as to where we stand right now, we've still got the momentum going into 2025. We still have, which a lot of people don't realize, we still have money coming into the economy from the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which will continue to provide support and create jobs there. Perfect example of that, Boise, the Micron project, over $6 billion from the CHIPS Act, and they have just broken ground. So there's jobs being created there. We're seeing the ripple effects from suppliers and everything else. So I do think that the outlook, my outlook for 2025, is that we will continue to see positive growth, but at a slower pace. And I'll explain why when I talk about the risk here in just a few minutes. So then the next question, as we look at the economy itself, this is what's actually happened with the economy. This is year-over-year growth of GDP, real GDP. And as you can see, we had back in 2022 when it was falling. That's when all of us economists thought, uh-oh, we're heading for a recession. And we told you, get ready for a recession. And we didn't get it because we did see more jobs being created, income picking up. And the bottom line is we have had above 2% growth year over year for GDP growth since the first quarter of 2023. So over a year and a half, basically, of solid economic growth. And that's why I just think that we've still got the base there that should give us positive growth going forward. So then the question comes down to, so what's going to happen with interest rates? And what I would tell you is, since you've had all the fun for the last year and a half, totally absorbed in what's going on in politics, we actually have another fairly major thing happening tomorrow when the Federal Reserve announced their decision as to whether they're going to lower rates at this meeting or leave them where they were after they cut them 0.5% in September. So I think that what the perspective I'm going to give you once again is the Fed is focused on, do we have their two mandates being met? Do we have full employment and do we have stable inflation? So when I look at full employment, the measure that I look at is if I look at the difference between the number of job openings versus the number of unemployed people. From an economic viewpoint, in theory, a 1-to-1 ratio is what you would view as full employment because we're never going to have every last person unemployed employed. So I think that what I would show you is when you look at this graph, prior to from when they started tracking job openings in 2001, we have seen from 2001 to 2018, we never had a situation where we didn't have more unemployed people, which is the gold line, compared to job openings. Then with the expansion of the decade after the financial crisis, we essentially started using up that available pool of labor. And by 2018, we were down to 1-to-1. And by 2019, we had more job openings than unemployed people. And it got to its worst right after the pandemic crisis, where we had 2 job openings for every unemployed person. We're back to basically 1-to-1 again. So I would say Fed should be comfortable. We've got stable full employment. So then the real question comes down to inflation. What I would tell you from inflation, the Fed looks at 2 indexes for that. They look at the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, which is PCE, and they look at the core number, which excludes food and energy. When I look at that, what we see is, as of September, core CPI year over year, 3.3%. The Fed's goal is 2%. Core PCE, 2.7%. Chairman Powell acknowledged that and saying, yes, we're not there yet, but we are confident that it's going to continue progressing to get there. So the only perspective I want to give you, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I took a little different perspective to say, let's look at this like as a business person, that if you were told by your boss, or if you as a boss told your employees, we need to control expense growth this year and keep it at 2% or close to 2%. You would want to get a report then each month from your controller or your CFO and say, what's progress to goal? Where do we stand with our goal for that? Here's unemployment, progress to goal. Through September, this is actually where we stand, not year over year, not anything annualized. This is saying what we have experienced so far for the core numbers. For consumer price index, we're at 2.4%. For PCE, we're at 2.2%, and we've got 3 months to go. The Fed is confident that number is going to come down. I'm just going to leave that open as that and saying that's what's making their decisions. Whether we as consumers are experiencing that, Von's is going to give you a great rundown on inflation and the impact to consumers and affordability. So I'll leave that for her. But I would just simply say I think there's still work to be done on the inflation side to expect dramatic reductions in interest rates unless you think the economy is going to suddenly tip over. So I think my outlook for you, short-term interest rates, they're going to follow whatever the Fed does. So if you have borrowing costs tied to short-term rates, whether it's an operating line, whether it's a line of credit, you're going to see your rate coming down. The question is just how far, how fast. If you are looking for funding for term funding, I'm not going to be very encouraging. In fact, I'm going to frustrate you because I'm going to tell you I'm not sure we're going to see any reduction in long-term rates unless the economy really starts to slow more or inflation starts to slow a lot more, because the long-term rates look more at two things: inflation, being compensated for inflation, and the amount of debt that the Treasury is issuing that they have to compete against. So what I'm going to tell you is I think that we're going to see long-term rates, 10-year Treasury between 3.5% to 4.5%. We are sitting close to 4.5% right now. We actually saw long-term rates show a vote of no confidence to the Fed's rate cut because long-term rates actually went up 0.5% when short-term rates went down 0.5%. So I'll just keep that in mind. I know that's frustrating to all of you in the mortgage world because I think we're going to still be between 6 to 7% for mortgage rates. Unless, like I said, the economy really starts to slow or inflation really starts to come down and the Fed starts to cut rates a lot faster. I'd also remind everybody, lower rates are great for borrowers. Lower rates are not great for savers. And that means both businesses and individuals. For the last 2 years, corporate America was sitting on $6 trillion of cash, earning 5%. That was great for their earnings. They're going to lose that as rates come down. Savers were beating inflation, earning 5% roughly on their savings, and now they're going to see that coming down. So there's always a trade-off of who, are lower rates good? I always say, well, who are you talking about, savers or borrowers? So the risks that I think we need to monitor, because always as business people, you want to be monitoring risk. What I would say is the one that I've already talked about, and again, I'm not going to go into detail, but what I would tell you is this is inflation for what I think consumers buy the most. You probably can't read the print. You can get it when you pull it off of the GSI site later for the slide deck. What I would just tell you simply is the red bars are all of those products or services the consumer buys where the inflation rate is above 2%. The green bars are below 2%. And what I would highlight is especially, the big outlier there, auto insurance up 16.3% year over year. That's real to a consumer. That's a very, very small weighting in the CPI calculation. So I'm just saying that's what a risk is, that if the consumer starts to get pressured more by further price increases, that could affect their ability to keep spending. The other thing we have to pay attention to is what I call essentially the lower half of the wage earners. The hourly employees have seen their hours consistently cut throughout this year. And even 2023. It's a case where businesses have been afraid to lay people off because they keep saying, well, you keep telling me a recession is coming, but it hasn't, and if I lay them off and my business picks up, now I got to go to pay more to get those people back. So instead of laying somebody off, they're cutting everybody's hours. And as a result, for an hourly employee whose basic income is their wage and their bills are not dropping, their bills are staying where they are or going up, every reduction in time worked is a reduction in their paycheck. So we need to monitor them because I argue they're the foundation of the economy. When they break, they stop spending, then it ripples up to the rest of the economy. So we need to pay attention to that. The other one that I can pay a lot of attention to is this next graph, which shows the number of people working multiple jobs. We are near record highs. I would argue most people don't take on a second job because they love to work and they just want to work more. It's because they're trying to pay their bills. And this is that group again that doesn't get caught in the national headlines because the upper income are still spending strongly. That gets buried. You got to go beneath the headlines to discover there are some cracks there that we have to pay close attention to. So I think the other thing that I would tell you, since I know that it's the standard question is, well, what about the elections? What about with President Trump? I'm just going to tell you quickly from an economic standpoint only. Tariffs are a tax. Every dollar you spend on taxes is less money you have to spend on investments or in purchasing goods or services. So all else being equal, if we truly implement more tariffs, that should have a slowing effect to the economy. Tax cuts, on the other side, if it's just a renewal of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that shouldn't really provide new stimulus because that's already in place and working. But if we get additional tax cuts, that would be an offset of a stimulus to the economy. So I think that the only thing I would say from that standpoint as an economist is we all need to remember that what's promised in a campaign season is rarely what actually happens in real life because you've got to get it passed. And even though the Republicans now have control of both houses, we do not have a united Republican Party. We've seen that for the last 2 years in the House. There's disagreement among them as to what their policies are. So I just simply say it's too early in this process to even know, other than to understand that taxes create a drag on the economy, tax cuts create a stimulus to the economy, all else being equal, and leave it at that. So the other things I would tell you is my closing thoughts for you then. I just simply say, we all have jobs to do, and we have clients that we need to serve. So I just keep trying to tell my team especially is, look, ignore the noise of politics. We have a job to do every day. We have clients to serve every day. If we focus on that and keep doing that, we're going to be fine. If we get caught up in all the emotions and drama and everything of social media and politics, you're just going to have anxiety attacks left and right. So I do expect, like I said, I think the economy will grow next year, but expect it to slow. I think that you should plan for interest rates declines, but if you're believing the bond markets or the financial markets who think that the Federal Reserve is going to cut rates from its peak overnight rate at 5.5 down to 3.5 by the end of 2025, I would caution you that if you're reliant on that type of a rate drop, you may not get it, especially if we see inflation is more stubborn than was anticipated. But we will see interest rates coming down in the short end. Long end, like I told you, I don't think we're going to have any dramatic changes there. I also give you my basic is that always believe what you're experiencing in your job or as a business versus what you're hearing on social media, especially if they're different, and just stay focused on what works and keep doing it. Have your game plan ready, meet with your experts, have your strategic planning sessions saying, well, if these policies do get implemented, what's our game plan? So that way, if it does happen, you're ready to go and you execute it. But if it doesn't happen, you didn't execute early and then go, woo, we just made a big mistake of changing our game plan and it didn't pan out. And I think the real key that I say over and over again, we as business people is, we need to make sure we're working with our clients and helping them stay focused on their businesses, because then you can identify opportunities, and opportunities is where we continue to see growth for the economy. So let me leave it at that. I'll turn it back to Paul. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Solid personal income growth, momentum going into 2025. No help on long-term rates probably, and interestingly, consumers are still getting hit, and there could be a risk there. But I most enjoy every year when Steve gets up here and says, if things are going well in your business or in your job, continue doing those things and avoid getting caught up in all the noise. So next up, we have Dr. Vange Hockheimer. Dr. Hockheimer is a tenured professor of economics and finance at Whitworth University's School of Business. She is also an affiliate professor of law and economics at the Gonzaga University School of Law. She received her BA from Binghamton University in New York and an MA and PhD in economics from Colorado State University. She currently serves on state and regional governing boards with roles such as second vice chair of the State Department of Commerce's Community Economic Revitalization Board and executive officer of the Spokane Symphony Fox Theater's Board of Trustees. She is married to Manny Hockheimer, some of you may know him, and has 2 children, wonderful children, Noah and Luca. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Dr. Vange Hockheimer.
Thank you, Paul, for such a nice introduction, kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Excuse me. As Steve mentioned, I will be talking about inflation, and I like to start my presentations with the main ideas that I want you to take with you once you leave here. Some of those ideas is that there are two perceptions of the economy, right? You will hear some folks saying that the economy is doing great, and right, depending on who you ask, and you would hear some folks saying that the economy is bad. And so a lot of that has to do with, if you're looking at GDP growth, which is currently in the last quarter, or the annual GDP for between 2023 and 2024 is 2.8%, which is a healthy growth, right? So if you're looking at GDP, you're looking at the unemployment rate, some of the figures that Steve mentioned, the economy is solid, strong, doing great. However, if you are the everyday American, the small business, or the business that's struggling with inflation, the economy is bad. That is going to be the perception that you're going to have. The core personal consumption expenditure has decreased to 2.2%, but consumers still face inflation above the Fed's target, as Steve mentioned, of 2% for many essential products that they consume. Although hourly wages have increased nominally, in real terms, affordability has decreased substantially. Although we have reached full employment, as Steve mentioned, significant labor shortages still exist in some sectors, and I'll get into that in a little bit. Labor shortages and the cost of living have pushed up the cost of labor. Higher labor costs are expected to persist, and I'll get into the reasons as to why that is, so we can expect to see inflation in wages going forward. And small business, because of inflation and the cost of labor, are under pressure, and many of them are struggling. Many of them are going under, unfortunately. So let me talk a little bit about, because we hear these figures, the core CPI and the core PCE, personal consumption expenditure. These figures are going to be a little bit different. They're going to be excluding energy and food prices. The one that the Fed likes to look at is the core PCE because it's a broader measure of inflation. However, it is the more conservative measure of inflation. It will exclude energy prices and food. So even though that figure is going down, right, when we actually take a look into what's in the core PCE and what's in the core CPI, which Steve showed a little bit of that, when we look at prices of goods and services that the typical consumer consumes, we see that that there's still significant inflation, even though overall inflation it's going down. In the third quarter, core CPI rose by an annual rate of 3.3%, as Steve mentioned, and the core PCE rose by 2.2%, 2.7%, and both of these measures are above the Fed's target of 2%. So if we look at inflation by different categories here, in the pie chart, we see that products that, these are the products that show the largest decrease in prices. And so that includes gas and other energy goods that have the largest drop in prices, about 18%. The next largest drop in prices we see is in motor vehicle parts. And in the bar chart, we see products for which we observe significant inflation above the Fed's 2% target, and above the PCE inflation of 2.2%. We observe inflation of over 4% in financial services and insurance, in food services and accommodations, and interesting consumer expenditure for services consumed or the services that they receive from nonprofit institution shows inflation of about 6%. This figure caught my attention because it is an important indicator of hardship for people. So let's look into that a little bit more. So household expenditure of nonprofit services represents prices charged by social welfare, healthcare, education organizations, and other organizations. It includes charities, shelters, hospitals, religious organizations, foundations, educational institutions, and other nonprofit institutions. As we can see in the graph, prices for these essential services rose dramatically post-pandemic and have remained above pre-pandemic levels. This data suggests a strong reliance in social welfare and healthcare programs which tend to increase when people are struggling. So this figure is included in the core PCE and not included in the core CPI. So given that some people are struggling, right, as I mentioned, it is important to think about, when we think about economic growth, that we think about economic growth in an inclusive way, right? So when we think about growth, we need to ask ourselves, who are we leaving behind, right? Is this growth a balanced growth? A small business is thriving. Are people thriving? Because when you look at GDP, it doesn't really show us, right? It just gives us a very macro figure, and it doesn't tell us, right, whether that growth, whether we're leaving some folks behind. So what is an inclusive economy? And we have talked about this term here at GSI. An inclusive economy is a free market economy where all people in the economy, regardless of who they are, can start and grow a business. They can save money for a rainy day. They can demonstrate resilience in the face of unexpected shocks and plan for retirement. And to be able to afford these things, they do need to make a living wage. So when we look at indicators of an inclusive economy, right, we see a few here, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but I will talk about what we mean by a living wage. So the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, has developed a regional living wage calculator. The living wage shown in the table is the hourly rate that an individual in a household must earn to support themselves and or their family, working full-time or 2,080 hours per year. This table provides living wage estimates for individuals and households with 1 or 2 working adults and 0 to 3 children. So I dug into the data and asked the question, does Washington pay a living wage? This table shows data on full-time employment by hourly wage, and it is from 2019 from the Employment Security Department. It's a little bit outdated, but they don't do this study often, so this is the latest data that they have. And according to the living wage calculator, hourly wage for 1 adult and 0 children should be $28.70, and this is for Seattle, for the Seattle area. So when we look at the data, we see that in the state, 32% of working adults make less than $20 per hour, and in Spokane, 41% of adults make less than $20 an hour. When you look at $28 an hour, in the state, 52% of individuals make less than $28 an hour. Remember, I said the living wage, according to this MIT calculation, should be $28.70. And in Spokane, less than 64% of the population makes less than $28 an hour. So I've had talked about inflation and affordability for consumers. Let's look at inflation for businesses. A significant cost for businesses is labor. As we can see in the labor force participation graph here, the participation rate for all Americans is still below the pre-pandemic levels. For all Americans, it was 63.3% pre-pandemic, and it is now 62.6%. For women, the participation rate was 58% pre-pandemic, and it is now 57.3%. And then the lower line would be for folks 65 years old and older. So the lower participation rate coupled with stagnant population growth will deepen, right, the cost of labor. So that's something to keep in mind, and that is expected to persist. So then when we go into, we said before, Steve and I both said that the economy is in full employment, but there are still some sectors that are experiencing labor shortages. So as we can see so when we look at, right, an economy is considered in full employment if that unemployment rate is right below the 5%, which is what we consider the natural rate of unemployment. We're currently at 4.1%. And so occupations with the largest labor gaps, and how we measure labor gap here is you take job postings minus unemployment insurance claims. This is for the Seattle-King County area. So the occupations with the largest labor shortages are healthcare practitioners occupations, management occupations, computer and mathematical occupations, sales-related occupations, and business and financial operations. When we look at Spokane, the labor shortage is smaller. However, we see a similar trend in the occupations where we're seeing the most labor shortages. That would be healthcare practitioner occupations and sales-related jobs, office and administrative support, healthcare technologists and technicians, and healthcare support occupations. So these shortages also contribute to inflation in the labor market. So to continue to track this increase in the cost of labor for businesses, right, we can see that the cost of labor for private industry and state and local government have skyrocketed post-pandemic, and that continues to put enormous pressure on budgets, as we talked about in the beginning of the program. That was, I think, Paul's questions on budgets, and that will deepen deficits. So small businesses are under pressure, right, because of the cost of labor and other inflationary issues that they're facing. And so this is disproportionately affecting small businesses. The NFIB publishes a small business optimism index using a quarterly survey of small and independent business owners. As you can see, optimism is low, and this is due to small businesses' inability to fill job openings and inflation's negative impact on earnings. So to conclude, I will remind you that at this economic forecast event, we have been talking about the need for fostering an inclusive economy where all people and businesses can thrive. It is my hope we can get there in a not so distant future. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanj. Economy is good for some, but not for others. Significant labor shortages remain in some sectors. In fact, I think I read correctly, Vanj, that up on your screen, 4 out of the 5 of those areas you showed shortages in Spokane are all in the healthcare arena. Alex, I know you're out there. We feel your pain. There he is. Finally, today we have my friend Dr. Grant Forsyth, Chief Economist for Vista Corp. Dr. Forsyth received his BA in Economics from Central Washington University, his MBA in Finance from the University of Oregon, and his PhD in Economics from Washington State University. Before coming to Avista, he was a professor of economics at Eastern Washington University for 13 years. Go Eags! He currently serves on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and the City of Spokane Mayor's Advisory Council on Economic Vitality. Please join me in welcoming Grant Forsyth.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me? Okay, so as I make eye contact, I can see you're suffering. It has moved me, which is real unusual, by the way. I will be efficient because I know that we want to have plenty of time for questions. So when we think about the regional economy, these are going to be the main takeaways today. Really, the Spokane-Kootenai metro employment growth has slowed significantly in the spring. Okay, and I think when we look at the data, you'll see how much it has, and it's primarily slowing on the Washington side. And we'll talk about why that might be. The good news, though, is leading indicators Okay, for example, initial claims for unemployment insurance, building permits, especially residential units that have been permitted, okay, all look good in terms of signaling, right, no recession and probably a return to employment growth going into the future, but probably it may be at a lower level than what we've seen coming out of the pandemic. But a big regional problem outside of employment is still housing. Okay? We're going to see that housing inflation, the rate of growth has clearly moderated, but unfortunately the price level of housing remains incredibly high. Okay? And I strongly suspect that is not going to go away, and we'll talk about why that might be. So let's talk about employment growth. Okay? And this really covers some things that both Steve and Vanj had mentioned, but what I'm showing you here is year over year, same month employment growth. So I'm looking at a moving 12-month growth rate for employment for the US, which is in the black line, and the region in the red line, which is Spokane Kootenai combined. And you can see that really high growth we had coming in January 2022. That's when the labor market started to normalize coming out of the pandemic. We had really high growth rates as firms rebuilt their labor forces. And we can see that that has gradually slowed over time, which you would expect, right? In addition to interest rate increases also probably having some effect on employment growth. Right? Unfortunately, what you see there on the red line is in the spring this year, we saw a serious decline in employment growth, something I hadn't necessarily expected. Okay? And most of this really occurred in both Washington and Idaho, but it was strongest on the Washington side. Okay? And we want to talk about why that is. And that's what this next slide is about. And I want to spend some time really talking about this because I think it really highlights what is driving employment growth right now in the region, in the state, and also it turns out in the US as a whole. So what we have here is a breakout, okay, of the Spokane metro area and the Kootenai metro area. And we're looking at contributions by sector. Okay, the green arrow is a sector that's contributed to job growth between the first 9 months of 2023 and the first 9 months of this year. Okay? The orange arrow is telling you what has subtracted from job growth. In other words, what has made a major contribution to slowing job growth in the region. And I want to focus on the Spokane metro first because really what's interesting is how broad-based the slowdown in the Spokane metro area has been compared to the Idaho side. Now, I think one of the reasons, and this goes into the recent election, is I strongly suspect on the Washington side, we had a lot more state-level policy uncertainty, right? We had a lot of initiatives. I think a lot of businesses, I suspect, were waiting for some clarity on what those policies issues are gonna, how they're gonna sort out through the election process. We now have some clarity on those issues, and I think, along with the fact that the leading indicators look pretty good, we should start to see maybe employment growth on the Spokane side pick up a bit, but maybe not at the same level we've seen coming out of the pandemic. So I do expect employment growth on the Spokane side to pick up again, but again, perhaps at a more modest pace than what we've seen, again, coming right out of the pandemic. Right. Now, if we look at the Idaho side, employment growth there has been much more broad-based. Okay? But even on the Idaho side, if you look at the last 6 months in Idaho, just 1 month after the next of the last 6 months, employment activity on the Idaho side has also stalled. But again, I think leading economic indicators look pretty good. Nobody is really forecasting a recession, so I do expect regionally employment growth to pick up again as we move into the new year. But what I want to highlight, though, is what has been contributing overwhelmingly to employment growth, and it's the category in the red box, okay? And that category is sort of an odd category. It's called education and health services, which is really private education and, of course, health services, which is the healthcare sector. And really, within that category, it's really dominated by healthcare. And what's interesting about the Spokane metro area is that was contributing so much to growth, right? That 0.4% that you see, which is pretty low. If that sector had not grown, employment growth over that 9-month period would have been about -1%. That's how strong the healthcare sector is right now. And I think what's happening is the healthcare sector is finally starting to fill those shortages that Vanj has talked about, right? But there's something else happening long-term in the United States. And I don't want to cast aspersions, but we're getting old, okay? And we love our healthcare. We can't get enough of it in America. And so the combination of these things, filling the shortages, the growing demand for healthcare, I think is really pushing up the need for healthcare employment, not in just this area, in the Spokane metro area, but if you go to the Kootenai side, it's the same thing. On the Kootenai side, that 9-month employment growth rate was almost 3%. If you take out healthcare growth, it falls to 2%. Right? That's a big change. That's how strong healthcare growth is. So I looked at data for all the other metro areas in Washington State. It's virtually all the same, except in a few cases. We have business activities in Oregon. I looked at Oregon and actually Oregon's been one of the worst performers in the Northwest in terms of employment growth. Even in Oregon, the one bright part is how fast healthcare growth is in Oregon. Right? But you can look at the US and you get the same thing. So what you can see is increasingly for both the US, for the states, and for the region, that health sector is really important in the employment growth that we're seeing, and the outlook is for that to probably continue. Okay, so I want to spend some time talking about one of the important leading indicators and why I'm a little more optimistic about employment growth going forward is residential units permitted. These are housing units that have been permitted. The red are apartments. The blue are single-family homes, duplexes, and condos. Okay? And what's interesting is really since 2015, we've only been permitting about 3,000 single-family or single-family-like homes each year. But we've seen population growth grow a lot, so where are we putting all these people? Well, it continues to be apartments. That's the dominant source of new housing for a lot of new people moving to the region who can't afford a home, right? But what I want to point out is look at 2023 to 2024, that estimate, we've stayed pretty good considering how much interest rates have gone up, especially long-term rates, as Steve pointed out. And so because the permitting side still looks pretty good, that gives me some confidence that the slowdown in employment that we're seeing won't be necessarily permanent. The other thing I've noticed is if you look at commercial permitting in our region is also up, and it's not all storage units like it has been in the past. Okay? So we're seeing on the permitting side, things look pretty good, considering that long-term rates are still not coming down as quickly as short-term rates. Again, good sign for future employment growth. And if you also look at initial claims for unemployment insurance between 2023 and this year, they haven't changed that much, which is also a good sign that there's no signal of an ongoing decline in employment. Cross my fingers. So let's talk about housing briefly. So this is a weak spot in the region. We do not have affordable housing anymore, not even close. So what I'm showing you here, this is seasonally adjusted data. I've done the seasonal adjustment myself. And it is the seasonally adjusted listing price for homes for the Spokane area in red, Coeur d'Alene in blue, the Tri-Cities in green, and the Lewiston-Clarkston area in black. Okay? For most of the region, listing prices for homes, and this is monthly data, so it's higher frequency data that I can usually have access to, is $400,000 to $500,000. That is not affordable based on median family income and current level of interest rates, right? Right? If you look at the Coeur d'Alene, that's even more exceptional. It has come down a little bit, but it's $700,000 list price. That is still not affordable by median family income. You can see, though, the growth has slowed, right? So the growth in home prices has slowed, but the price level still remains high and unaffordable. And there are other problems worsening affordability that we should be aware of. One is the insurance market. We have big problems with the insurance market all across the United States. I'm increasingly concerned about an outright insurance market failure, right, where people either can't possibly get insurance for what it costs, or there's none to be had in the first place. I've been harping on this for a while now. As a policy matter, it's really important because a lot of economic activity can't happen without affordable insurance. The other thing, and this goes back again to something Vanj talked about, is we have these categories of inflation that are occurring. One of the categories that really took a big hit in terms of escalating is maintenance costs on homes. That is also exacerbating the ability of people to buy a house, because it's more than just the purchase price. You've got to pay for the insurance, if you can get it, and you've got to pay for the maintenance, and it's no longer particularly affordable for a lot of people. So outside of the single-family market, that leads us to the apartment market, which I've pointed out, again, this year and many years. This is where a lot of people are actually going to live as they move into the region. This is how we're housing people. It also is not particularly affordable. So if you look at rent per square feet, this is on Spokane County only, we see that big increase occurred in spring 2022, right? So we went from about $1.18 per square foot in rent to $1.35. That's a 14% increase. It's huge. It's going to take years for people's income to catch up with that kind of change, right? Now it has started to moderate. This year it'll be around 2%, which is closer to what the Fed would like to see overall inflation at, right? But it's still, in terms of the level of rents, are still pretty high, and many households are still struggling to adjust to that within their budgets. Now, the good news, though, is because of all the apartments we've been permitting, and many of those are now coming online, the vacancy rate has finally started to rise. And we're starting to get to the point where the vacancy rate is normalizing. If you look historically, something between 3 to 5% is more normal on average for the region. When it gets below 2%, that red area that you see in the graph, that's where you really have to worry that you might start to see some rent pressure occurring. But the good news is we are seeing the rate of increase in rents moderate. We're seeing vacancy rates rise. And as more of these apartment units come online, we could actually see maybe rents actually fall a bit, which I think from a kind of social welfare perspective might be beneficial given the rate increases we've already observed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant. Clarity on some state issues. Should start to see some employment growth, although modest, I understand. What I really liked hearing was, it seems like a couple of years ago we were talking about we are going to have a recession. And last year was like, yeah, we might have a recession. Might be a third quarter, might be smallish. This year, and I'm going to quote you, nobody is forecasting a recession. So next year, Grant, we can hold you to that fire. Thanks to all three of our speakers. You did provide us some clarity. Not everything was great news for me to hear, but it was certainly provided us some help. So we're going to begin a Q&A, and I'm going to ask some people from our fantastic Public Facilities District to come and take this podium down. Maybe. They're coming? Okay, great. We got workers coming. Okay, we'll get going. Whoa. It's a deep chair. Seemed like last year we had a leg come off one of the chairs, didn't we? Yeah, a little excitement. So we're going to start off by, let's just address the elephant in the room, and literally the elephant in the room. We had some election results last night, early this morning, and I think we just want to kind of be done with that conversation in a brief manner because we have a lot to cover. But from an economist's perspective, what did we learn about these election results, and what impact might they have on the economy? We have quite a few questions here in that realm, including about foreign policy, tariffs, independence of the Fed, immigration. Give us your quick comments on the election results from last night from an economist's perspective. Who wants to take that?
Well, this came up at a presentation I gave to a small group on Monday. And the problem I have is that both during the election process, both sides were, and I'll use this term just as I did on Monday, both sides were sufficiently opaque about the details. It's very difficult to evaluate what it all means. But that being said, things the region just needs to be paying attention to through our elected officials. And I've been quoted in the Spokesman Review. Tom Klaus called me and I beat him to death about it. I have a lot of concerns on both parties have gone anti-trade. I have a lot of concerns about that because it's really important to our region. We need to keep an eye on that. What does that mean? There's a lot of emphasis now, I think, with the Trump administration with the polite term is fiscal consolidation, which is actually, cutting spending. The region does have a lot of connection to federal spending in various ways. We need to keep our eyes on that and just try to understand what the consequences of that might be as it evolves in Congress.
Yeah, I look at it from an international trade perspective as well. As I tell my students, a tariff is a tax, like Steve mentioned. And so if we see tariffs all across the board, I know that there were tariffs imposed in the past, and those tariffs are still in place. But if we raise those tariffs and impose them across the board, we can expect to see some imported inflation, and then if those countries retaliate and impose tariffs on our exports into their economies here in Washington, we would feel that pain as well in terms of less exports.
One thing I add to what I had already said is that we have a historical example. The Smoot-Hawley Act imposed heavy inflations. And most historians would say that either caused or was a significant contributor to the Great Recession because of the dramatic slowdown in the economy that happened there. So only other thing I would add is that if tariffs, if those get put in place, the part of the economy that's most exposed is small business. Because small business relies on cheap manufacturing overseas to be able to compete against big business, and they don't have multiple supply chains. So the real risk, I would think, is that if businesses try and fully pass through the cost of the tariff to their product, the Federal Reserve is going to be a lot slower in lowering rates, or may pause and not lower rates at all, because if higher prices, that means you're starting to see inflation creep back up again. So as Grant said, it is way too early to know any of that, but that is just from a general economic perspective, what I would say is that small businesses is the one most at risk with tariffs.
And a quick follow-up, because it received quite a few upvotes with threats of deportation and likely reduced immigration. How do you see that playing out nationally and regionally, I assume in the labor markets?
I think if you take away a labor source, we've already, as Yvonne just pointed out, there's a lot of businesses still with labor shortages. I think long term, if that was the case, the U.S. is going to be more isolationist and not have as much import. Immigration has always been the historical solution to our labor issues, and at the point when labor costs rise sufficiently, businesses will then say it's cheaper to go to automation and robotics, and that has a long-term impact to people then when their jobs get eliminated.
Yeah, I would echo what Steve said. Legal immigration has been used as a strategy in the past when we have had slow population growth, and it is a source of labor that we utilize. And so if we get rid of legal immigration, that can be a problem, and it can increase labor costs that are already pretty high.
Yeah, and I would just point out that the UN has a population data center. It's really kind of interesting to go look at their population forecast for us and the rest of the world. It's really hard to find a country now in the developed world or the middle income world that doesn't have declining population at some point in the next 10 years. It's really interesting to look at China. By 2100, they predict China will have roughly half the population it does now, because, globally we're moving towards sub-replacement population growth. That means, fewer babies are being born and future generations will be smaller than past generations. And in some countries, that's occurring quite rapidly, okay? I mean, you can look at countries in Europe, you can look at Russia, it's all the same. The two countries that look better are the US and Canada. If you look at our projections, we still show some population growth by the time you get to the late 2030s, but it's only because of the assumption that we still have immigration. If you pull that out of the forecast, right, we're going to start to look like other countries, right, where we have a declining population overall. And all I say is that has some interesting consequences, and we just want to make sure that we think through all the possible consequences when we engage in a pretty significant change in policy like immigration.
Thank you. And this next question from the audience is about consumer debt. And I know last year we talked a little bit about the possibility of a credit cliff, I guess, on the consumer side. So the question was, Steve talked about risk to his outlook but didn't address specifically consumer debt. When does the level of debt catch up to consumers and impact spending?
I would say at the point where you've hit your credit limits and you can't borrow anymore. I've laid out to my board of saying that we might actually see this has been a completely different economic cycle, and we might see a completely different recession. That traditionally, recessions are people getting laid off, then they cut spending, and it goes from there. This could be a case that people are still fully employed, but they hit the wall, they can't borrow anymore, and now they have to try and pay off that big debt, and they're forced to cut spending. And we see this dramatic slow in sales while people are still fully employed, and the unemployment happens as a second stage, not as a first stage. So to me, it may sound like a simple answer, but it truly is that as long as they've still got credit lines available, and we're seeing more, I can just reflect in talking to various bankers that some of the only activity we're seeing right now in the home loan business is cash out refinancing, where people are pulling out the equity of their house as a cash machine essentially so that they can continue their spending. So when those sources run out, you're not the US government. You can't deficit spend. You can't print money. And I think that's when the problem hits.
Yeah, I echo what Steve said. We're starting to see a slowdown in consumption for certain luxury items and so forth. And so perhaps that will balance out, right? They can balance their credit availability with their consumption. But I think that the jury is still out on what will happen to defaults and things like that, and if we're ever going to get there at this rate.
Yeah, I mean, I just think a lot of people absorb the inflation increases via debt. And, there's limits to, as Steve pointed out, there are just limits to how long you can do that. And I think also if you look at the interest rate associated with that kind of debt, you have to be really careful how much you build up, because you can quickly get swallowed by the fees.
I think one of the points to support what Vaughn's just talking about, the data looks good, people say it's not as good, is that if you look at, it gets missed in the headline numbers again, that delinquency rates and charge-off rates are rising, but they're still pretty low. You go beneath the surface to the subprime borrower, the credit score of less than 450, they're double digit. So that sector, the forgotten group there that Vaughn just talked about, they're already getting crushed, and they're already buckling under that problem, and now they're having to make tough choices about spending of, I got to make my payment unless I'm going to default on my debt. So does that mean 2 meals rather than 3? Do I pay my rent but not this? That's going on, but you just don't see it in the macro headlines.
Related question, how long do you think this resilient consumer can handle inflation at this rate? The Fed has said that it is wanting to be proactive in cutting rates. Should it be cutting rates if inflation is above target and inflation may go back up?
I'm the outlier on that because I've argued all along, why did they cut rates?
You're not the outlier. My students here in my class know that I was shocked that they went 50 basis point, that they cut it 50 basis point. I'm like, they're typically, right, according to monetary policy theory, you cut rates when you have a recession, right, the threat of a recession or a recession. We, according to the indicators, right, we're not in recession territory, so I was pretty surprised.
Part of the question I posed to my board, because Chairman Powell said, we're cutting rates to bring it back to the neutral level. What's the neutral level? And as I've said, this is the one-of-a-kind economic cycle because we never had a cycle where $5 trillion of stimulus got it started. So all the historical models have just been wrong. I mean, they're struggling to catch up with that. So I was saying, just posing the question, saying, so let's see, we've got 3% economic growth, we've got 4% unemployment, we're still creating 180,000 jobs a month. What if we're far closer to the neutral rate than the Fed's anticipating, and they're assuming we've got to bring it down to 3.5, when really you should stop where you are right now?
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Well, the other interesting thing is on that is if you look at, I follow the Employment Cost Index, which is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's actually the best measure of what's happening to wages, not just wages, but also total compensation. You can look at either one. And, there was, starting in 2022, going for 3 or 4 quarters, inflation was way above what people were getting in terms of wage increases. But in the last 3 or 4 quarters, we've seen that flip, and now finally workers are getting a little bit more than inflation. I know that's hard on business, but I also think that's actually kind of good news because it means at least some households are starting to recapture some of their purchasing power that they lost in that early cycle when inflation was just a lot higher than their wage gains. And what that means is, at least for some households, it gives them a little bit more room on the spending side without maybe using so much debt.
We had several questions. And by the way, great job out there in sending questions. We have way more questions than we'll get to, but I so much appreciate it. Back on the labor side, labor force participation peaked in 2000. How concerning is the decline, and do you see it reversing at a certain time or percentage level? Labor force participation rate, one of my favorite subjects.
Well, I think that's also tied with a sluggish population growth. As Grant mentioned, we just don't have, right, the same amount of workers than we did before. The pandemic didn't help that, right? There are folks that 65 and over who decided not to come back to the labor force. Women, as you saw in my data, also, right, that labor force participation rate is lower. And a lot of it is tied to affordability. A lot of people are choosing, because daycare, Steve had that in his data, daycare is one of those items in the CPI that is right, it's pretty high. And so a lot of parents are choosing to, one person stays home, the other one works. And the idea there is that it is more expensive to work than to stay at home. And so those dynamics are playing into the lower labor force participation rate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're also seeing the baby boom accelerate in terms of their retirements. That's going to affect participation rates. But there was an interesting presentation I saw a couple weeks ago, and my colleague Paul Kimmel, where are you, Paul? Paul, was the name of the company Lightcast? Okay. We work with a company called Lightcast that does some really interesting labor market stuff, and they pointed out that one of the things suppressing labor force participation is the number of young men who have been incarcerated, right? And the number of young people who have a drug addiction problem. And so that's another tough one to solve. And so again, I think between what Von's talked about, accelerating retirements of baby boomers, incarcerations, drug addiction, we may see a suppressed participation rate for a while.
Mental health
Yep.
issues as well.
Yep.
We had a couple of questions on the increase in insurance premiums, and I know you, Grant, have been talking to us about that for several years now. Here's one of those questions. As an apartment owner operator experiencing roughly 30% premium increase year over year and $100,000 deductibles, can you talk more about vulnerability and potential impacts that are growing in this instance?
Yeah, and actually I forgot to mention that. I meant to mention that when I talked about rents. So the same insurance pressures that affect single-family homes, sooner or later that has to be built into rents if you're a landlord. It has to be, right? And so what that does is potentially give us another cycle of rapidly rising rents as landlords try to cover those insurance costs into rents. Now, it could be the case where it becomes just impossible to do that and landlords decide that they're going to do something else with their property. But on the other hand, doing something else with your property means you still need insurance. And what happens if you can't get it for that? And so the insurance market and the stress it's under, it's really hard to get around that if you're a landowner, because it's no matter what you choose to do with your property and your structures, you're going to potentially run into insurance problems.
And that ties into the affordability, that graph that I had on nonprofit healthcare institutions, right? If they can get healthcare services for cheaper through a nonprofit, right? They're going to, right? Everybody's going to go there. Well, what is that going to do? That's going to put a lot of pressure on that institution, and eventually the prices that they charge for their services, which are supposed to be low to help those that are struggling, that's also going to rise, and we see that in the PCE measure.
I think the other thing to remember there, the American model, especially different than the European model, everybody wants to have their property and their land and everything, versus Europe has highly dense cities and open space. Well, the more we keep sprawling out into that area is the risk for fires and things like that. And yet, if you try to deliver the message, people say, well, then don't live out there, drop another house inside. First, neighborhoods would fight that density, and then others just say, I don't want to be that close together. But I mean, that is part of the struggle, is we as American dreamers, we want to be able to live out in this open country, and now it's catching up with us with the environment and the floods, fires, those types of things.
Well, and I think that's an excellent point, and I think that's one of the reasons, if you look at the building permit data that I follow, and it's weekly data from the construction monitor, you've seen a really big increase in the share of what I'm defining as single-family homes as townhouses and duplexes, because I think it's an attempt by builders and developers to more efficiently use space, but also provide housing that it's perhaps, hopefully, more affordable than a whole single-family home. But a lot of that is happening in more developed areas. And maybe that's what we're going to see in the future, is a single-family home, that first house people start their family in, is really more of a townhouse or duplex setting rather than a traditional rancher or something like that.
Alicia, how are we doing?
One or two more questions.
Okay, got it. Another labor question. I suspect there are a lot of folks in this room who have children who are graduating from college, so I think this is where this is coming. And since we're forecasting, what's the forecast for the class of 2024 or the class of 2025 college graduates, either regionally or nationally? What prospects do they have now?
Well, I would say probably it's going to be a little bit tougher market than what you've seen in the last few years. I would expect you're going to have to work a little bit harder to get that first job. I think your ability to negotiate pay will be more constrained, right? But it will also really depend on what your degree is in, right? I think increasingly what your degree is in is mattering more and more in the speed at which you will get your first professional job, right? Which is why I always encourage parents, because many of you are footing potentially large bills. I know it's love, but it's still a large bill, that you need to make sure you talk to your kids about, what are you going to do? What are you doing with this degree? What have you looked into it in terms of what your career opportunities are? Because given the cost of even a regional education, I think you really have to choose carefully, because I think the labor market is increasingly more interested in what your degree is in.
One of the things I found fascinating and disturbing, I've seen, and now I'm tracking it because I got like 3 different posts on it, but on LinkedIn, I've seen like 6 different posts where somebody says, white collar job, I got laid off, it's been 18 months, I can barely even get an interview, this type of thing. And there's like 500 responses saying I'm in the same position. And I've seen this, like I said, 5 different rounds of these types of posts. So it indicates to me that the white collar jobs, it really matters, like Grant is saying. And I think one of the real problems we have in today's world, because you're screened first by your resume with AI or whatever, so that it may wipe you out just by how you wrote your resume, but then a virtual interview is far different than an in-person interview, and there's not in-person interviews until you get to a kind of like a final stage. So a lot of these people are struggling and saying, now I have to learn a skill of how to have a virtual interview, that I'm an expert in accounting or whatever, lost my job. I never had to worry about, well, how do I talk to somebody on a screen and convince them that I'm worthwhile? And they're all struggling, figuring out what I've got to do now to actually get my foot in the door to have a chance of finding a job. So it's fascinating to me to see those posts.
Yeah, I would add, if you saw the occupations that have the largest labor gap, I think that would be a good way in terms of when you're exploring what you're going to major in college, to look at the market demand for the jobs, and then perhaps tailor your degree in a profession or occupation where the labor gap is going to benefit you.
I mean, just quickly, I think it was, I don't know if it was in your paper or the Spokesman, talked about there was a group of kids at a healthcare facility. I think they were probably middle school or high school kids getting a tour of what do people do inside one of these facilities. And I think that's the kind of thing that's really useful in getting young people to think more carefully about what am I interested in and what could I do with this.
And just a quick highlight for anybody with parents and kids getting ready to go to college or whatever, I'll continue to remind you that IT is the third smallest industry for actual jobs. So everybody wants to be in IT, but behind mining and logging and utilities, IT, third smallest, so the chance of getting in there, you better have a high quality degree, otherwise you're going to be working in a regular job at a Vista or Washington Trust or Whitworth in your operational support. Not saying those are bad jobs, but they're not the sexy jobs everybody thinks that I'm going to be a computer programmer. You're going to be a help desk support person.
What about newspapers?
Well, that's assuming, no, never.
And with that, I'm getting the hook. Please join me in thanking 3 outstanding economists. And thanks to you for so many great questions. Sorry if we didn't get to yours, but I think we learned a lot today. So I'm going to give it back to the boss lady, Alicia.
Thank you, Paul. Let's give all 4 of them a round of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow, I just am always, there's so many things to be thinking about. And as I started a bit of the conversation, I'm hopeful. There's a lot to do. I've been saying a lot, the issues are significant and the opportunities are huge. And so what do we do with all of that as individuals, as leaders, as organizations, and collectively? So just, again, a huge thank you to each of you for your thoughts and inspiration and leadership as we navigate forward, both to the end of the year, but also into 2025. As we close today, just a few things to think and take away with you. Certainly, I want you to know that GSI wants to be a partner and is a partner with each and every one of you as we think about these really big and complex needs and issues. We just had our National Association CEO for chambers across the country in town, and we just surveyed chambers of commerce across the country, and the top 2 issues facing all of those communities: childcare and then housing, which we heard over and over and over again, which has direct impact into labor force participation and to all of the things that each of you are thinking about that make your organization and business go around. So we're thinking a lot as we head into 2025, as your regional economic development organization, we're thinking a lot about childcare access, stability and sustainability around childcare, and want to partner with all of you around those creative solutions as we think about how we stabilize childcare here in Spokane County. There was a lot of conversation today about small business and about our diverse business sector. And there is so much opportunity to ensure small business and our diverse businesses that are the backbone of our economy continue to be able to operate here. Lots of resources and tools and supports, great partners like Ahana and Snap. And so looking forward to working with each of you forward in 2025 on ways to make sure we continue to sustain our small business economy here in Spokane. And then the last thing I've been thinking a lot about this morning has been around just the continued need to be innovative and to be creative and on the front edge. And this community's been doing that over and over again as we think about our industry sectors across the board, whether it's education, whether we think about advanced manufacturing, life sciences, the creative economy. Lots of opportunity for us leaning forward together in the things that create community and that drive investment and jobs day in and day out. So we look forward to partnering with each of you ahead in that really important and critical work. And so again, I want to thank each of you for showing up this morning and putting a foot forward, drinking some coffee. A few things to take away. Thank you to our sponsors, to US Bank and each of you for making it possible to be here today. On your tables, a little spot of color. You'll find a colorful pen to take with you. Mine's pink, which was kind of fun as I've been taking notes today. So a little spot of joy, but also attached to that is a promo code for our first event in 2025, which is the State of Education. And what an awesome way to kick off the year, as we've heard over and over again about the things we need to do to stabilize our workforce, and education sits at the core of that. And then lastly, before we wrap up 2025, we do have one more big opportunity to come together, which relates very much to how where we sit today, which is our legislative kickoff before the 2025 legislative session. So there's information in your packet to be able to register and join us for that conversation as we work with our state legislature on the things that are important to this community as we move forward. And there are some big things to get done at the state level. So again, a huge thank you to each of you, to our sponsors, to the incredible GSI team who was here very early to make all of this possible. And I wish each of you a really awesome day as you go out and lead boldly. Let's lead with kindness, and maybe have a cup of coffee with somebody you haven't met recently. So with that, have a great day, everybody. Be well.